All right, we're live.
Wonderful. All right. Welcome back, everybody. It's good to have you back here. We are on day 4 of our 5-day trip through the 2021 Pennsylvania Virtual Turfgrass Conference. We've got good news today. I got word back from the GCSAA, and so we've got GCSAA points for the week. And at the end of today's talks, then I will post numbers for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So I'll have all those posted. So for you that are in, that are interested in GCSAA points, I'll have all those numbers posted, and we'll have one more for tomorrow. So I think each day is worth 0.2 points, 0.2 points for each day. So that was good news this morning. Just got that. So again, as a reminder, for your pesticide recertification credits, if you would. A number of you are already putting your names and information in. Please put your name as you would see it on your card, your state of residence, and your certification number. And appreciate that. And so then from there, I think we'll just turn it over to John and our speakers.
All right, thanks, Brad. I'll just kick us right off. Starting with Dr. Fidanza. Dr. Fidanza is a professor of plant and soil science and holds a teaching and research appointment at Penn State Berks. He teaches undergraduate courses in turfgrass science, soil science, botany, pesticide safety, and a graduate course in turfgrass physiology. His research projects include turfgrass ecology, integrated pest management of turf diseases and weeds, including working with fairy ring, as well as plant and soil health in turfgrass ecosystems. At Berks campus, Fidanza established Valentine East, which we just heard about his newest and latest donation, courtesy of John Chissard. That's a 30-acre turfgrass experimental station modeled after Joseph Valentine Turfgrass Center at Penn State. At Berks, he's also the director of Penn State's Center for Agricultural Sciences and Sustainable Environment. So with that, I'm gonna get started. I'll also give Dr. Fidanza a slap on the wrist for sending me his talk as a PowerPoint, because Mike, when I hit play on your PowerPoint, I can't use my computer because it stops your presentation. So now I'm basically shut down from checking email for the next half hour because of you. So thank you.
Thank you. Welcome. You're welcome. I'm sorry, everybody.
That's all right. It just means I get to focus on your talk more. All right. So let me get started here. Share my screen. Everybody able to see the fairy ring? Somebody unmute themselves and tell me they can see the talk.
Got it.
Yeah. Good. All right, we'll start. Thank you. Sorry, everybody. I realized that I didn't share my computer sound. So if you're wondering why there was no sound, that was my fault. I'll start it over again here.
Of all, one thing you could do is to visit this Chemical Control of Turf Diseases 2020 document. You type that in on a Google search. It'll come up as a PDF file. It's developed, assembled by folks at the University of Kentucky, and it's basically a one-stop shop kind of a place where you can go and you can see all the turf diseases listed and all the fungicides labeled for those turf diseases. So we're going to focus today on fairy ring. This is a list of all of the fungicides currently labeled for fairy ring in turf in the USA. And it lists all the products by their active ingredient name and their trade name. So if you look at this particular list here, again, it shows all of the fungicides as, again, active ingredient, azoxystrobin, for example, and trade name heritage. These are products with a single molecule, single active ingredient in them. And then it lists the combination products now. You can break them down into these, really complicate things a little.
All right, we're gonna start this over a second. Can somebody unmute and tell me what they were seeing? Ben said that they were only seeing my desktop and that was it. So I don't
That's
know
all I
what
was
happened.
seeing also, John. Just seeing your desktop.
Correct.
Were you hearing his presentation?
Yeah,
We were
keep
hearing hearing the presentation, but only saw your desktop.
All right, so I'm going to start playing it, but keep your sound on and tell me if you see it. I'll just go back a slide so that I'll go back a couple slides. Sorry about that, everybody.
Sometimes with those PowerPoints, you may have to actually close it out and then just start it all fresh.
It's stupid because you can't just pause the PowerPoint. It's like once it starts going, it goes. So give me a second. I'm going to see if I can share the screen again. I apologize, everybody. Okay, what are you seeing now?
Chemical control of turfgrass diseases 2020.
So you are seeing his talk.
Yes.
I'm going to hit play.
Good.
Oh.
One thing you could do is to
Can you hear him now?
this chemical control of turf diseases 2020.
We do. We are on slide 2, I think.
Type that in on
All right,
Google
sorry,
search.
everybody. I'm just going to let it go from
Come
here.
up as a PDF file. It's developed, assembled by folks at the University of Kentucky, and it's basically a one-stop shop kind of a place where you can go and you can see all the turf diseases listed and all the fungicides labeled for those turf diseases. So we're going to focus today on fairy ring. This is a list of all of the fungicides currently labeled for fairy ring in turf in the USA. And it lists all the products by their active ingredient name and their trade name. So if you look at this particular list here, again, it shows all of the fungicides as, again, active ingredient, azoxystrobin, for example, and trade name heritage. These are products with a single molecule, single active ingredient in them. And then it lists the combination products now. So we have many combination products. These are fungicides with 2 active ingredients in them, and they're also labeled for fairy ring. Now, let's take a look here at these fungicides. Really, one of the first ones actually to be labeled for fairy ring was this one right here, ProStar, the active ingredient flutalanyl. Again, I mentioned ProStar, but now the trade name is called Pedigree. We'll talk about that in a minute. But flutalanyl was first developed going back into the 1990s. Really, the first fungicide labeled for fairy ring. It's also labeled for rhizotonia or brown patch. But since the 90s and since ProStar and since flutalanyl, we now have so many more fungicides available. And the question always I get asked is, well, which fungicide is the best one to use for fairy ring? We have so many choices now to choose from. So if you look at all of these fungicides, they're also listed by their FRAC code. And looking at this table, you'll see there's an efficacy rating and then the interval or days. This is from the product label, which indicates the application spray intervals. Okay, there's some 28 days, some 7, 14, 21, etc. For the most part, it's a 3 to 4 week interval on most of these products. The efficacy rating, this refers to the plant disease management reports and if these fungicides were evaluated in these reports and what their results were overall. For example, a rating of 3 or 4 indicate that very good control of the disease with a rating of 3 or 4. If there's a rating of L or low, that doesn't mean it's a poor disease control. It just means there's not that many reports. There hasn't been that many field trials, conducted on this fungicide for this disease. So anyway, again, when you look in that report, you'll see this information. But again, let's dive into this a little further. Let's talk about these fungicides and how they can all be really effective for controlling for fairy ring. As you can see, there's so many now to choose from. You can break them down into these really 4 frac codes, primarily 3 though. The frac code 3, the DMIs, 7s, frac code 7s, SDHIs, frac code 11, the QOIs, or the strobilurins or strobies. Now, of the DMI group, Maxtima and Tourney are labeled. Many are products contain the active ingredient tebuconazole. That's been available. Balaton is the oldest one in that group. That's again labeled for fairy ring. Frac code 7. These are pedigree or flutalonil. This one, flutalonil, is again the oldest chemistry. It was Prostar. Now the trade name is Pedigree. And Exemplar Valista Posterity. These are again all these frac code 7s, SDHIs, are very, very effective for controlling fairy ring. There's a lot more research on the SDHI group than some of the other groups. Frac 11, your strobies. Heritage is one that was also labeled for fairy ring after Prostar and flutalonil, and then others came on board after that. But all these strobies, again, are very effective for controlling fairy ring. Affirm or polyoxin D is one that is also labeled for fairy ring. Xerotol is labeled, but again, not much research on that one. The frac code is not really classified. Anyway, so this gives you an indication of all the fungicides that are labeled for fairy ring and their various frac codes. But then we'll complicate things a little further, and let's look at the combination products. Okay, looking at these combination products here, you have Heritage Action, for example, and the azoxystrobin under frac code 11 with asabenzolar, okay, which is frac code P1. So the majority of these combination products contain these strobies or QOIs that are really doing the heavy lifting in all of these sort of combination products. And many of them have a strobie along with a DMI in them. There's a few that do not. Lexicon, for example, has pyraclostrobin with this particular product here. Exemplar is the trade name. Sistar is one that has flutalonil with thiophanate-methyl, for example. But again, most are, these combination products of a strobie with a DMI. Again, very good products. All these are very good products for fairy ring control. Okay. There's a new one on the market. This is called Calida from FMC, 4-pound AI per gallon formulation, SC formulation. And again, this is a SDHI and a DMI combination product. Let's see, it's this particular product, the trade name is Rayora, okay, and it's included with this new SDHI. Anticipation for this product launch and registration, I believe it's first quarter 2021. So look for this product, Calida. It will also have a fairy ring. It will also be labeled for fairy ring. So again, there's so many fungicides available for fairy ring. Let's dive into them a little further. Prostar, again, was one of the first ones labeled for fairy ring, but now it was carried by Bayer. Now it's under the jurisdiction of PBI Gordon, okay, under the trade name Pedigree. ProStar started out with a 70 WP wettable powder formulation, then went to a WG. Now it's Pedigree as a SC, liquid formulation. Okay. Again, it's a frac code 7, it's SDHI, the trade name flutalanyl, just like in ProStar. It's a 3.8 pounds active ingredient per gallon. The labeled rate for ProStar, again, on this particular label, there was a preventative rate and a curative rate, okay, on the label. So pay attention to these product labels, though, for information on preventative and curative application rates and timings. ProStar, again, had this language on the label. Pedigree also has preventative application rate, curative application rate. And again, this is a good example when you're looking at the fungicide product label for ferring. Really read that label. There's further information about making the applications, recommendations for successful treatment of ferring, that kind of thing. Don't skip this. Look, read the label carefully. So that's Pedigree SC, and then comparing the rates, the 2.2 ounce of ProStar preventative rate, 1.54 active ingredient. Same thing, Pedigree SC, the 3.25 fluid ounces gives you the same amount of active ingredient. Okay, and you have the same thing with the curative rate, 4.5 ounce, 3.15 ounce active ingredient. But Pedigree is going to be a little more, 6.6 fluid ounce, same amount of active ingredient. So again, please double check and triple check the label application rates. But again, the point I want to make here is the same active ingredient in ProStar is the same amount of active ingredient that you're applying with Pedigree. And Dr. Bruce Martin at Clemson University, this is one of his studies there looking at Pedigree versus ProStar for ferring control, and very, very similar results because they're both flutalanyl active ingredient. So special thanks to Dr. Brian Anardi, a Penn Stater from PBI Gordon, who was able to help bring Pedigree to the market as a liquid formulation, again, under PBI Gordon. And then Brian posted this on social media, on the Twitter, showing this Pedigree application, 2 preventative applications in the spring. And what you see is a lot of fairy ring symptoms around the treated area. So this is actually a really good ferrying site. For those folks, pathologists like me into ferrying, this is a really active ferrying site, and this is an area where ProStar was applied. So again, ProStar is a very good fungicide for ferrying. One of the first fungicides labeled for ferrying. But all those fungicides listed can do a good job for ferrying control, but all of those fungicides listed can also fail miserably if they're not applied properly. So please keep that in. Valista fungicide, again, recently labeled for ferrying a few years ago. Again, a very good fungicide for ferrying. I want to just point this out. On the Valista label, you see this tank mix sequence listing. I think you see this on other labels as well. But I really like this because oftentimes, we're going to tank mix a couple of products in to save time and to make a couple of active ingredient applications at the same time. But you got to sort of pay attention to how you mix things in the tank. Your water-soluble bags you want to mix first, followed by this Valista product or other water-dispersible granules, WDGs, then your wettable powders, then your suspension or concentrates, that kind of thing. Your ECs are last. Typically your adjuvants or surfactants are down toward the bottom. So this is sort of the mixing sequence. This helps get these products into solution. If you're going to tank mix, be very careful in terms of turf phytotoxicity, turf injury, but also you want to make sure these products are in solution in your spray tank and that you're going to be able to apply them effectively. So again, looking at the label rate, looking at the labels information, this will help if you're in a position to tank mix several things at once. With ferrying control, I don't really recommend tank mixing other products in. With ferrying control, I like just either apply a fungicide by itself or a fungicide and soil surfactant tank mix, and that's it. But we'll talk about that a little further. let's look at Syngenta's preventive farrowing solution program. If you're going to go after farrowing in a program approach, whether you're using the Syngenta program or you're using a BASF program or you're using a Bayer program, again, read the information carefully and you must follow it thoroughly to the letter, okay, for any chance of success here. So with Syngenta's, it starts out with making the applications in the spring when soil temperatures around 55 to 60. Here in the Mid-Atlantic region, that's about the same time when we start to see crabgrass. We get soil temps, our minimum low soil temps at 54, 55 degrees for 4 or 5 days. That's when you start to see crabgrass will first start to germinate. Also, kind of sort of corresponds with forsythia in bloom, and as the forsythia blooms are falling, and the flowers are sort of wilting away, the soil temps are reaching around 55 Fahrenheit. So you start your preventive farrowing fungicide application at that time, okay? And again, on the Syngenta label, it says preventive fungicide applications do not require tank mixing with a soil surfactant, but curative action applications generally do. That's something to think about. I would prefer to have a soil surfactant application in a program, a monthly program starting in the spring, either making the soil surfactant application by itself or with farrowing, tank mixing the two and watering them in. The watering in part is very important. Okay, so on the Syngenta program recommends irrigating, after the applications are made. If the farrowing fungus has traditionally or historically been up in the upper thatch area, you don't have to water it in that much. But if the farrowing fungus is down below into the root zone, obviously you need more water. And repeat applications on regular intervals. This is important in a Syngenta farrowing program, like any program really. One application, unfortunately, is not going to give you season-long farrowing control. The environmental conditions are such in the spring, summer, and even early fall that farrowing can show up. So you have to keep your foot on the gas, so to speak. If you look at the Syngenta program again, let's see, starts out with the Valista program. Yes, Valista, and then Briskway is your next application at about a 28-day interval, followed by a Headway, then followed by a Heritage Action. Okay, these are a typical farrowing program. And also look at the water carrier volume. When you're making fungicide applications for farrowing, you don't want to use 1 gallon of water per 1,000 square feet as you traditionally might do. I like 2 gallons of water per 1,000. 4 is even better. I know that's a lot to ask. You need water carrier volume. You need post-application irrigation. So the fungicide applications, again, all these fungicides labeled for farrowing can be very effective, but application strategies are very, very important. Okay. Now, on the Syngenta labels for Headway and for Heritage, they said that on the label it says you can allow the fungicide, to dry on the turf and water it in at night or before the next mowing, and that's fine. But I prefer personally to water it in right away. That way you don't forget about it. Now the BASF program, they have a couple of different ones. They have a Zone 1 here for cool season greens and fairways. Zone 2 is for warm and cool season transition zones, so to speak, warm and cool season turf. And then Zone 3 is Texas and Florida. Okay. In Florida, you tend to see farrowing show up from January to May. This is their dry season, so to speak. And same with Texas. So let's focus on the cool season greens program. It gives you application 1, 2, 3, and 4. Gives you a season-long program starting in the spring. Again, you could start with that 55 degree to 60 soil temp initiation timing. They recommend Exemplar first, followed by Navicon, followed by Lexicon, followed by Maxtima. So if you look at the Syngenta program, you look at the BASF program, there's different fungicides that are rotating in and out. This is actually a very good strategy because there's about 60 farrowing basidiomycete species that cause farrowing. And we don't really know, which fairing species are more susceptible to which fungicides. They all should work, but we don't really have that information at our fingertips, so to speak. So to rotate different fungicides going after fairing, I think it's a good idea. So again, this is your BASF program. And again, I believe the labels will say 21 to 28 day intervals, but double check the labels. It gives you timings. That's on the greens program. This is on a fairway program. Again, your spring program, 28 days later, your second program, 28 days later, your third application in the program. The first program gives you some choices. You can either go with Honor or Insignia. Then your second program, Maxtima or Exemplar. Your third application in the program, Lexicon or Maxtima. The reason why you have a couple of choices here, it depends which fungicide can fit into your program better. Whatever works better for your golf course, for your program. There's some flexibility there. This is something you have to kind of think about. Which of these fungicides will work better with your overall, fungicide program, and of course budgets. That's very important as well, obviously. The BASF program. My buddy Dr. John Cesar, retired from the University of Florida, but still active in turf research and consulting, has done work with BASF on fairing. If you look at this particular site here, there's a gap there. You have a type 2 fairing symptoms here with this particular area that's no symptoms. That was treated with Lexicon, I believe, in this particular trial. He's had really good luck with Lexicon fungicide on the fairings there in southern Florida. They're the puffball types that show up on those screens down there. Scott Waltz there, again, posted on social media using, let's see, this was Max Team, I believe it was. And looking at the application on August 4th, 11 days later, you see the symptoms dissipating. And almost 3 weeks later, the symptoms are barely noticeable. This is an important point, making sort of one curative application. You see this is type 2 fairing here, and you see these symptoms here. They may persist, even with the fungicide application, they may persist. That's the fungus is breaking down that organic matter, releasing nitrogen. The nitrogen is being picked up, and you see these sort of green, green rings and arcs, making the fungicide application sort of arrest that fungus, and it's going to take a while for that nitrogen to sort of get depleted and for the symptoms to fade away. What you don't want is those dark green rings to become wilted, dead, necrotic turf. And that's, again, where your fungicide and soil surfactant program comes into play here. Bayer also has some detailed language on best management practice to minimize fairy ring, talks about cultural practices, core aerification, very important, punching holes, getting air into that root zone, reducing fats, reducing organic matter. There's other seminars and webinars that can deal with that. Also recommends applying a plant growth regulator. If you use plant growth regulators, apply them separately or at least 1 week apart from a DMI application. You don't want to complicate things there. So you got to think about that when you're making fairing applications. If you're using a DMI in that application, kind of tailored before or after your PGR apps. Again, we talk about water volume. The more spray water volume, the better. Irrigating in the applications, using soil surfactants or wetting agents, very, very important. And again, reapplication of the fungicide. One application typically won't give you season-long control of fairing. You have to stay on top of this. Okay. So that's the Bayer fungicide program. It gives you details as far as like a northern program, Balaton or tartan, followed by Balaton or tartan again, followed by ProStar, which would be Pedigree, and then there's one for New York only, which is a slightly different, adding in the Mirage Stress Guard component to that. So again, these are examples of fungicide programs for Syngenta, for BASF, for Bayer. If you're going to go with one of those, stick with it. Maybe 1 year use Bayers, 1 year use BASF, and then the 1 year use Syngentas. You can rotate them back and forth. That may be a very effective approach to managing fairing. Again, from the bare literature, this shows ferritin can spread and kill large areas of putting greens, yes. And then the same picture taken 1 year later. What you'll see, sometimes you'll see ferritin really become aggressive 1 year, and you can make some fungicide applications, and then you may not see it the next year, or it may come back this next year. It may come back more aggressively. So when you're making preventative fungicide applications, you really got to pay attention to what you're doing. You might get away with not using a preventative the following year, but you may not. So err on the side of caution and stick with your preventative program. And if you don't want to use a preventative program, use an early curative program. But monitoring and constantly paying attention to the weather and monitoring environmental conditions is your best plan here as you sort of, again, plan for fungicide application for ferritin. So read and follow label instructions, pay attention to the product rate, water carrier volume, application intervals, and please read all the comments on the label. This is your best first step to managing ferritin. Also, look at the location in your sites where you typically have seen ferritin. Do you see the fungus colonizing the thatch, upper root zone? This will give you an indication of how deep you need to water the products in, and the soil surfactants as well. Okay. From our buddy Derek Settle there down in the south in Atlanta, pulled out some soil plugs, and you could see the ferritin fungus down into that thatch layer, just below the thatch layer. So treating ferritin here, I would punch holes with a needle tine or solid tine, punch holes, apply a wetting agent, soil surfactant, water it in, then apply a fungicide, water it in to really get that material down into that thatch and root zone. So we have preventative options, okay? Consider sites that historically have had ferritin for you, greens or fairways, or sites that year after year you've seen ferritin, so you may want to start a preventative fungicide program. But don't forget the cultural practices, thatch management, organic matter management. And if you're not on the soil surfactant program, get on the soil surfactant program to manage that soil water repellency and hydrophobic soil conditions that can occur with ferritin. Okay. Curative options, I call this the early curative. Just when you see symptoms, you can make applications. If you're not on a program, again, it's helpful to punch holes, make a fungicide application, water it in. Prior to that, use a soil surfactant, or really use a fungicide soil surfactant tank mix combination and water it in. You might, again, one application might do it, but you might need to come back for the second application to really manage these symptoms. It depends on the environmental conditions. If you're going into a hot, drought stress sort of environmental period, a second application is probably going to have to be a choice for you. This is called the all-out necrosis curative option. You need to punch holes. You need to use a fungicide soil surfactant combination, water it in. Definitely come back 7 to 14 days later to get a handle on this. What you're trying to do is stop the fungus and get this turf to kind of regrow and recolonize again. It might be a situation where it's too far gone and you might need to have to slice seed in there with one of those Vrado seeders, for example, but you have to throw the kitchen sink at this one. You have all this sort of these layers here. It's very difficult to get a soil surfactant through there or a fungicide through there. You have to manage organic matter. Cultural practices are key to manage. So are we drying the soil down too much? With ferritin, I think we do. We pass this what's called critical water content. In other words, when the root zone becomes too dry, it sort of flips. It goes from wettable to non-wettable. And under those conditions, ferritin fungi thrive. They're rapidly trying to colonize the thatched root zone to go into this reproductive phase. You'll get mycelium. You'll get the necrotic zone showing up. So again, if we're drying our soil moisture down, if we're drying our root zones down too much for firmness and lean and green speed, things like that, we can get into trouble with ferritin. Using the soil surfactant can buy us some time. It can maintain some level of uniform soil moisture that can help us along the way, but we really got to be careful of this. So use your TDR probes or your POGO to monitor soil moisture, volumetric water content. know your threshold, know when what you have to know what amount of volumetric water content is too low. This is an example of a golf course in Ireland. Colleague sent this picture, and it shows soil surfactant application made to this green, not to this part of the green, obviously to the right, and you see the drought stress there on the right, and this is where you'll often see farrowing symptoms showing up first. Okay, so here these are two applications. Let's say probably application in early May or early April, then early May, and the photo is taken after two applications. So you see how you maintain good soil moisture uniformity. This is really a good step to managing farrowing symptoms. When things start to dry down too much, then you're going to get in trouble with farrowing. So the bottom line, ladies and gentlemen, cultural practices, you've heard me say this before: aeration, punch hole, surface venting, focus on plant and soil health, manage the organic matter, manage the thatch, manage your soil water status with a good soil surfactant program. Okay, you want to try to minimize the impact of these wet, dry cycles. When things are starting to dry down and things are starting to dry and things are hot and dry, wilt, farrowing fungi can really kick into gear where you're going to start to see damage. Using a fungicide program, if you're going to go with a Bayer program, Syngenta program, BSF program, pick one and stick with it through the season. You can rotate the programs throughout the years, but don't rely on maybe one application getting you season-long control of farrowing. That may not be the case. So there are many fungicide options for farrowing. I wish I could tell you there's exactly one that's the go-to fungicide, but they're all very effective. They're all labeled for farrowing for a reason, but they can all fail if you do not apply these fungicides effectively. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of the conference, what's left of it, and best wishes in 2021.
All right.
Is anybody still awake, John, after that now?
That was an invigorating talk. I enjoyed that. I don't know if we have any questions. Are you sticking around to the end?
Yes, I'll be here.
So let's do this. Let's move on to the next presentation because we got a little bit delayed because I couldn't figure out how to work sharing the screen. So we'll go on to my presentation and we'll just take questions at the end. So for those who don't know me, I'm a professor at Penn State and focus on golf course turfgrass management, specifically the management of diseases, but also weeds as well. I'm trying to read my bio, but I don't want to read half of this stuff. Basically, I run the 2-year program and conduct research on turf pathogens, cultural and chemical management, and I'm going to be talking about anthracnose today. So let me share my screen and make sure this is working. Okay, welcome to day 4 of the Pennsylvania Turfgrass Council's 21 virtual turfgrass conference. I wish we could be in person as always, but this will have to do in 2021. Today I'm going to talk to you about anthracnose management on annual bluegrass putting greens. We're going to talk about managing annual bluegrass in general, but also some of the cultural and chemical practices that we can implement to help reduce disease severity. So obviously, anthracnose is a major concern for people, and it's something we saw a lot in the 90s, and then we kind of started getting into better management practices for annual bluegrass in general, and so we saw reductions in the disease. So I thought I'd start there and just talk about how we manage turfgrass putting greens, cool season putting greens, whether it be a mixed stand of annual bluegrass and bent or one or the other. All right, so when we're talking about managing annual bluegrass, not anthracnose, but annual bluegrass, there's a lot of things that we can do that are going to influence the health of that turf. And they can include both cultural and chemical, things like the timing of our cultivation, various fertility programs we implement, and then obviously our chemical management strategies, both from the standpoint of PGRs and any herbicides that may come into play. One of the biggest things that we have to deal with is soil disturbing practices. So anything we do that's going to pull up annual bluegrass seed at a time when it wants to germinate is going to result in more annual bluegrass. Now, if you're trying to manage annual bluegrass as your desirable turf, then that's great, right? We can time it around that September, October timing. But if you're trying to get rid of annual bluegrass, then you have to be real careful about the timing of when you're going to do it. In terms of fertility, this is one thing that we've seen people try to get on the lean is mean side of things. And if we do that, that's going to favor creeping bentgrass. It tends to do better under lower nitrogen fertility, but there comes at a cost to that, especially if you have mixed stands of annual bluegrass. And we've been working on management programs with fertility for several years, and it's taken a long time. We have studies that have been going on for about 10 years in the field to be able to really see an impact of lowering that fertility. And at some point, you usually have some turf loss because it's not quite ready for low nitrogen. And then phosphorus, that seems to be positively correlated with annual bluegrass populations. Phosphorus obviously essential for root growth. And as we put more phosphorus down, those annual bluegrass seeds that are constantly germinating at various times of the year, and new plants that are putting new tillers out and sending new roots out, they need that phosphorus there at the surface. And then finally, iron. We can implement iron programs to, one, just enhance color, but two, high iron rates are going to impact annual bluegrass more so in a negative way than creeping bentgrass. So some people have used these high iron rates to try to reduce their POA, or lower rates just to try and have a general overall good health. So obviously we do a ton of things that can influence the health of our annual bluegrass or our creeping bentgrass and mixed systems. But let's take a shift now to looking specifically at Anthracnose basal rot. So originally, all of you that went to school in the prior to 2000s, we always saw this as Colototricum graminicola, but it's been renamed now and it's officially Colototricum cereale. It can attack both Poa annua and bentgrass species, but we rarely, if ever, see both species being affected on the same putting green. Typically, it's going to be one or the other. On annual bluegrass, we tend to see this occurring at various times of the year, ranging from right after snowmelt in March all the way up through November. Whereas on creeping bentgrass, it tends to be more of a stress-related disease. We see this in Maryland and southern United States, where they're growing bentgrass, and you have that hot stress, and that's when we tend to get it on bentgrass. All right, so if we look at some of the symptoms for those of you who haven't seen it, those basal rot symptoms and signs, from the symptom standpoint, we typically have these small yellow-orange spots that start to check out. So the leaves turn orange and then a bright yellow and then just brown, and they die. Typically, this doesn't happen in a uniform pattern. It's kind of scattered, so that makes it difficult to initially identify it. But sometimes if we have point inoculations on slopes of putting greens, we can see them start to kind of V out in a pattern where it starts in one point and then it basically V's down with the water. And so sometimes I'll go visit a golf course, a year after they had a severe anthracnose outbreak, and I'll see these V's, and since bentgrass usually fills in, there'll be these V shapes going down the slopes, and I'll say, like, it looks like you had anthracnose last year, and everyone's like, how would you know that? And those are kind of dead giveaways after you've seen it for a long time. In terms of how you identify it, this is really easy. You can pull out a plant that has that yellow oranging look, and you can look at the stem base. You can do it with the hand lens, or you can just do it with your naked eye. But what we're really looking for is at the early stages, we have those black spines or hair-like structures called a cervuli or setae on the leaves, and that's kind of the initial phase. I caution people to use, when they use that for an identification, because anthracnose or Colototricum is one of the most common saprophytes on dead and dying turf. And so it doesn't necessarily mean it's causing the problem. It just means it's there and could be because of other reasons. What I like to look for are the black kind of fly speck cushions that you see at the stem base. And I'll show you examples of what I mean by all these signs and symptoms here. Okay, so non-uniform pattern and a mixed stand of bentgrass and POA. We've got the yellowing and the orange color to the turf. If we take a closer look into there, we start to see, that turf that starts to decline. We've got some green tissue in here, but a lot of orange, yellow, and even brown. And you see where this arrow is pointing here, we have the acervuli, and those are the fruiting bodies. And then the little black hairs that you'll see coming out of there in the next slide, those are the seedy. And those are indicative that you have anthracnose, but not necessarily the basal rot form of it. Okay, so under a microscope, this is what we would see. And you clearly can see these black hair-like structures. And located within this fruiting body, this asexual fruiting body, will be hundreds, if not thousands, of spores. And those can get splashed around and cause new infections. And so from your standpoint, if you're going to identify this on your golf course, you pull out some plants that are either dying or dead, and you look for the stem base. You tend to pick off all the older leaves. You take maybe 3 or 4 older leaves off, and just look down at that black stem base with the infection cushions that are down there. So that's kind of a dead giveaway. When we see it in the lab, we look for that as well, but then we also take those structures and we put them under a microscope, and we look to see what the spores look like. And the spores are these lunate shapes, these kind of crescent moons, and they have a specific size. And all of those things combine, right? The symptoms in the field, the oranging and the yellowing of the leaf, the blackening and the infection specks and cushions at the stem base, and then these spores, that's basically the definitive diagnosis that what we're dealing with is basal rot anthracnose. Okay, so in the late 90s, probably early 2000s, a group of researchers from around the country and even in Canada, initiated and led by Bruce Clark at Rutgers, took on a project looking at how do we really tackle the anthracnose problem. And this thing went on for years, but really did set the stage for making anthracnose manageable. And what you're going to see as I go through some of the data that's been published over the years is that each cultural practice that we implement provides some additional suppression of the disease, right? Take fungicides out of the equation. Just look at each cultural practice. Not one of them alone is going to be enough to solve your problem. But if you start looking at each one of these stacked on top of each other, we can reduce the disease severity to a level that all of a sudden our fungicides become more effective. And that's really the critical part about managing and dealing with anthracnose. Okay, so let's look at some of the various trials that were done. These were done at Rutgers, and they really pummeled this. I mean, they took it to another level with looking at all these different practices. And the 2 main researchers, aside from Bruce Clark and Jim Murphy, who did a lot of this work as the PIs, they had grad students that worked on it. And those grad students are now faculty at other universities, namely John Inguajato at the University of Connecticut and Joe Roberts at Clemson. So some of the things that we looked at, they looked at this from the scratch. Some of the recommendations we were giving in the late 90s and early 2000s turned out to be poor recommendations. We always thought of anthracnose as a stress disease. And so we told people to back off on any plant growth regulators and back off any cultural practices that would be aggressive. But when they started looking at they said, we got to rule those out from a research standpoint. And they started looking at some of the things. Now, some of the things that they found, coincided with what we expected. If you look in the top left graph here, that's looking at low and high seasonal nitrogens, with low being 1.5 pounds per year and high being 3 pounds per year. They basically made applications at 1/10 of a pound of nitrogen every week for the high nitrogen and every 28 days for the low nitrogen. And simply the addition of nitrogen, getting up to around that 3 pounds per 1,000 square feet, they saw a significant reduction in the disease. but you still got disease, right? So by the end of their season, they were still up at 40% disease, even in the best plots, right? The ones getting 3 pounds per year. But they saw a reduction. And they said, let's look at mowing heights and mowing frequencies. And so for the top right graph, if we look at it, what you can see here is that, again, the disease progression followed the same general pattern, but as you raised your mowing height from 0.11 inch to 0.125 to 0.141, we saw a reduction in disease severity. And they basically, these lines parallel each other. Not complete suppression, but still pretty good suppression. All right, the next thing, if you go to the bottom right graph, they looked at mowing frequency, and they said, okay, I think the premise behind their study here was if we have to raise mowing heights, we're gonna get screamed at by golf course superintendents because they need the green speed. So they were looking, how can we mitigate and manage some of that speed or maintain that speed while still reducing anthracnose? And so what they found was, if they raised their mowing heights up a little bit, but they mowed more frequently, on several of the rating dates, they had a significant reduction in anthracnose from extra mowing. So you're mowing twice a day, which is counterintuitive to the stress factor that we talked about. And so I think their recommendations now are if you can bump up the mowing heights even a little bit, to reduce some of the stress, but then just mow more frequently to maintain the speed, then that'll help you in the end. And that was something that was interesting because we would have thought adding that extra stress of additional mows would be a negative. And I think, I don't know exactly, but I think that kind of led into some of the work where they were looking at traffic patterns and rolling on rolling turf to see what impact that would have on anthracnose. So in the lower left, you can see that they have a roll versus a no roll plot over the course of the season, and not a huge difference between the two, but vibratory rolling every other day actually resulted in a reduction in disease over the course of the season. So now we're talking about implementing practices that are going to cause stress and reducing the disease. And I think they followed this up with traffic, even looking at foot traffic. I remember the slides they had in the presentation where they had, these customized Rutgers golf shoes, and they basically had students traverse the plots, and where they had more traffic, they had less disease. And I can't remember why they figured that was, but traffic didn't seem to be as negative of a factor. It actually seemed to be positive in some cases. So moving on, the next area that they were going to look at was top dressing frequency as well as the rates. And so what they did is they looked at no top, on the right hand side, no top dressing, 1 pound or 1 cubic foot of sand per 1,000 square feet and 2 cubic feet of sand per 1,000 square feet. And they applied these either 7, 14, or 28 days. And when they did that, they saw something surprising. And this is going to come up again in my recommendations at the end when we kind of summarize, all right, if you have anthracnose, here's a program, here's what you're going to do. They started applying these top dressings and doing this about when the disease was going to be active in June. And you'll see, they go from 0%, and among all the treatments, whether it's 7, 14, or 28 days frequency, or 0, 1, or 2 cubic feet of top dressing, they all started to increase into mid to late July. It wasn't until we got to a period where they reached a critical mass of this top dressing and started seeing recovery or no recovery, where the separation really started to shake out. And what they found was that frequent top dressing every week, and at 1 versus 0 or 2 versus 1, the more top dressing they put on, and what it was is burying the crown, the more top dressing they put on, the less disease and the quicker recovery they had. And I'll talk about this a little bit towards the end of the talk, in the sense that you have to be careful when you start the top dressing program. There's no doubt, and I'll show you in the next slide, there's no doubt that top dressing helps, but top dressing will, at the start of when the disease is active, is actually going to result in even more anthracnose, because it's injuring the turf. Okay, so here's just a visual from Johnny Mujado at Rutgers, where you can see this is back in 2006, shortly into the study, and where they did not apply any sand, you see significant anthracnose injury, and where they applied either 1 or 2 cubic feet of sand every 7 days, they have very, very little injury, significant difference in terms of the reduction in the anthracnose. So if you remember a few slides ago, I talked about that cumulative effect. This is one more thing that you can add into your program to hopefully continue to bring that level of anthracnose down. And this slide says it all. This is my favorite slide that Johnny Mujado made when he was presenting these things. And it's just amazing the difference in terms of where that crown is placed and how susceptible it would be to traffic and damage from foot traffic or mowing or wily rollers. So when you don't put any sand down, those crowns and that continued growth of the plant tend to stay at the top. So any pressure down on the area where there was no sand, any pressure down is going to ultimately result in that crown being damaged. And as you start increasing your top dressing frequently every 7 days, and you bury those crowns and keep up with the growth, basically that mower is riding on top of the surface and not pushing down into the crowns, it's pushing down into the sand. And as you notice, the crowns of those plants are 1/2 to 1 inch below the surface, and they're protected. And this is one of the greatest discoveries in terms of research on anthracnose in the last 50 years. We used to tell people, no, do not top dress, do not do that at all. And now it's a matter of the timing of it. The key is as growth is occurring, you want to continue to top dress, bury that crown and keep it below the surface and protect it. And that really was a great thing that came out of their work. Another thing that came out of their work, and I don't have their data, but I'm going to share some of our plant growth regulator data. They found that plant growth regulators did have an impact on anthracnose in a positive way. Now, if we think about PGRs in general, they're used for a variety of purposes on golf courses. We obviously have seed head suppressants, which is important for annual bluegrass. We obviously want to help to reduce growth. We heard from Elliot on Monday, and he talked about the increased use of PGRs in roughs and fairways in areas that you just couldn't get to this spring or last spring because of COVID. And so the reduction of growth is important. And in some cases, for instance, when you take florprimidol or paclobutrazol, you can actually get some disease suppression with it, namely from dollar spot. Now, the 3 most common regulators that we use for growth suppression on turf are trinexopec-ethyl, florprimidol, and paclobutrazol. The trade names of the originals are that would be Primo, Cutlass, and Trimit. And so those are the most common, but we do have some others that'll be important to talk about. Now, as it relates specifically to annual bluegrass, trinexopec-ethyl, it's not going to suppress it. It's actually like candy, right? Both bentgrass and annual bluegrass love Primo, trinexopec-ethyl. And so, if you're trying to favor your annual bluegrass, then you would select this PGR. On the other hand, florprimidol and paclobutrazol, they're not by themselves or in combination. They're not seed head suppressant, but used over time regularly, they can help to reduce the POA populations relative to bent. They do require repeated applications, and if you break that program in midsummer because you're nervous, you're going to get a resurgence of that POA, and you're going to kind of lose all momentum that you gained. There are a lot of people that tank mix trinexopec-ethyl with other growth regulators. I find zero value in that from a standpoint of managing annual bluegrass. My feeling is you either want annual bluegrass and you apply trinexopec-ethyl, or you want to suppress annual bluegrass and you apply florprimidol or paclobutrazol, because that to me is the purpose of those. Having said that, I get where superintendents are coming from, where they say, I just don't like the regulation I get with just one or the other. I tend to get more regulation and more consistent regulation when I combine Primo with one of the other Primidor or Paclobutrazol. So I get it, I just don't buy into that philosophy. I think it would be more important to look at some of Dr. Krauser's work at the University of Nebraska, his growing degree work, and trying to more fine tune your reapplication intervals based on growing degree days and stick with one or the other of these PGRs. Now, we do use some, that bar got screwed up here, it's supposed to cover up Embark, but we do use some PGRs for seed head suppression. When used in combination with trinexapac ethyl, Ethifon is, or Proxy is a good PGR, and that's what we see most people starting to use, that kind of Primo Proxy applications in the spring. We've also done some work, and I'll show you with that's a relatively new PGR on the market, prohexadione calcium. When used in combination with Ethifon or Proxy, again, we see pretty good seed head suppression. And then one that's pretty underutilized but can be effective is Maintain CF 125, I think it's called, chlorfluorin methyl ester. That is also another one that we've tested, and it seems to be pretty good with seed head suppression. Just note that multiple applications of Ethifon by themselves, at least in our area, and particularly on fairways and other taller turf areas, that can cause some etiolation or elongation of the stem, and you can get some scalping. I think that's why the addition of either Primo or a new is helpful there. And then the last one, Embark, we love that. I used to use that all the time around here. We always found it to be fairly effective in our region, but I guess the sales just weren't there. They weren't making enough, so it basically is discontinued. Some of you may still have some on the shelf, and we still evaluate it, but it's not available anymore. All right, I thought I'd just share a few of our PGR trials here. Let's see if I can turn my video off so you can see. Basically, we've looked at Maintain at various rates. The high rate's the most effective, but it can be injurious. The 1 pound rate seems to be pretty good. Embark, in this case, applied at a later growing degree day, and actually used different base temperatures as well relative to the Primo. Pretty good control. Primo Proxy applied, looks like April 1st and April 15th. At 220 growing degree days with a base 32. That seems to be pretty good too, relative to the untreated control, which had about 70% seed head cover in this particular study. And then here's just the same thing in terms of Primo Proxy, but in this case, we're looking at a new plus Proxy. And this was one of the first years where we looked at, this was 2018 applications. We started this in the fall of 2018, so December 13th. That seems to be growing in popularity in terms of the efficacy. Based on what we saw this year, in 2019, last year, or a year and a half ago, we didn't see a difference between those fall and spring applications, but people still like to do it. What it does is it seems to make the window of your applications a little bit better in terms of not feeling like you have to nail that window in the spring. You get a first application right around your snow mold timing, and then you come back with 2 more Proxy applications. And in this case, we did a lower anew and then a higher anew, or 2 higher anews. And as you can see, based on those orange and the blue lines, excellent control of seed heads, where the untreated got up to almost 80% of the plot area covered with seed heads. And so following up on this, as it relates to anthracnose, the Rutgers work showed that the seed head control, followed by continued application of PGRs to store those carbohydrates in the crown, again, suppressed the disease to some extent, right? And when I say suppressed, I mean it brought it from 60 to 50% or 50 to 40%. It didn't just control it, but it suppressed it a little bit more. All right. And so if you start thinking about the cumulative effect of these programs, if we do nothing, say we get up to 70%, which is pretty common in our untreated plots in our research trials. And then we do seed head control and we bring it down a little bit. And then we add seed head and top dressing and we bring it down a little bit. And then we do top dressing and seed head plus mowing. And then we add fertility onto that. And as you'll see, this is just a fictitious graph, but as you'll see, every one of those things start accumulating that effect. And it's a lot easier from a fungicide standpoint to suppress the disease when it's, say 40% versus when it's 70%. And that's what's going to ultimately make your fungicides work better. And that's the key to managing anthracnose. Get your cultural programs down right, and then follow it up with effective fungicides in a programmatic approach. Hey, once all those programs are done, those cultural practices, once they're modified, then you can start thinking about implementing your fungicide programs. And like I said, fungicide programs, it's important not to just say fungicides, but programs, they're most effective when they don't have to do all the work, right? The cultural practices did a lot of the work for them. Now they're just picking up the tail end of it. All right, so from a fungicide standpoint, I showed this slide on Monday. These are our anthracnose trials at Valentine, and this is when the disease is just getting started, but you start to see that whatever fungicides are listed in this particular trial, they're starting to have an impact, and some are working and some aren't. And so I'll give you an example of what I mean by programs. In this case, we had, this was a Syngenta program, a couple Syngenta programs that they had provided us that we were evaluating this past year. And you see our disease peaked in July at around 72, 73% in our non-treated. And here's two programs that were put into place, some of which get applied every 2 weeks, something like Daconal Action and Appear, which by themselves seem to be pretty good. And then they start rotating other products in. Secure Action is not one that we really get a lot of control of things with, but it's good as part of a program to help with, say, dollar spot that may be coming in. A Certainty, Medallion, Velocity, Primo, applied at periodic times. The key to this is that rotation and never having a gap in your treatment where you're not going to have something for anthracnose. And you'll see we had all these extra things thrown in, but when we just looked at Daconal, Appear, and Primo by themselves, they held up pretty well too, right? We had 0.5% in either one of these programs. This should be program 2 in the middle of the graph down there, not program 3. So the DAC, the Appear, and the Primo by themselves, just that would be great. Now, I don't recommend that as your only program. You should also look at putting other things in there because you're not just managing anthracnose, but that program worked very well for us. And this isn't really a fungicide part of it. It's more fertility, but I did want to show it. This is a trial we did with Brandt or Grigg Brothers, and pretty interesting to see, right? Daconal Ultrex is in most of these applications. That by itself is not going to work very well, right? 3.2 ounces of Daconal Ultrex applied every 2 weeks is not enough. It'll provide you some suppression. But what you'll see, we put just about the equivalent rate of urea in treatment 6, and the nitrogen by itself, statistically, it didn't suppress it. It brought it down a little. But when you talk about some of these other plant nutrient products in combination with a low rate of even something like Daconal, we can see something like this treatment in the middle. And to be honest with you, I don't even know what all these products are. I tend not to pay attention to a lot of the fertility-based products, but we put them on based on what they recommended. And so we have Gary's Green Ultra, PK Plus, which be a phosphite, which is pretty good in combination with Daconal, and Tufftopia, I think that's what it's called, Turftopia, I think is what's supposed to be called. And we went from having 75% in the untreated to only about 50% at our peak activity. And that's a significant influence or a significant reduction just by adding some of those nutrients into there. So I think this is actually the trial that had those in there. And you can see that when we were at our peak, it's not complete control in all of these products. We see significant control in a lot of these plots relative, to the untreated that you see here. And that's just some nutrients. So imagine adding on the seed head suppression, adding on the mowing frequency and the mowing heights. We can have pretty good effect with these combination products. Okay, so as I wrap up the recording here, I kind of am going to summarize based on this is what I would suggest that people do if they're going to try to manage their anthracnose, right? If they have problems with anthracnose, this is what I would say is good. First, always consider controlling your seed heads in the spring. And then once you're done that last application, get on a regular application of your PGR throughout the year. If you're trying to manage annual bluegrass, I say primo. If you're trying to get rid of it, then I say trim it or cutlass, or one of the combinations. Increase your fertility, like a pound or a tenth of a pound to an eighth of a pound every week to 10 days is good. If you want to alleviate some of the stress, increase your mowing heights, but then you can increase your mowing frequency if you have the manpower. Things like lightweight rollers, not mowing when they're excessively wet. Solid rollers in the summer during the stress period. I think this can be important, especially if you're not top dressing as much. But the top dressing program, I say start early and keep it consistent to keep those crowns buried. If you have anthracnose coming on and you haven't been burying those crowns, don't just go in and start a top dressing program because it's going to be too abrasive and cause things to kick up. Diverting traffic, walk on, walk off areas still can be important. And then I add this at the bottom, increase potassium applications because they can help reduce winter kill in the following spring. And if you're starting with a new stand of turf that's trying to regenerate from winter kill, it's going to be more susceptible to anthracnose during the year. And then from a chemical control standpoint, I base all of this on the chemical control of turfgrass diseases that was updated in 2020 from the University of Kentucky. And basically they list the chemical products or combination products that work best. If you have severe outbreaks routinely, then I usually say start your program 2 to 3 weeks before those anticipated symptoms. Where you have chronic use and you need to get kind of caught up with things, I tend to tell people to tank mix chlorothalonil plus some penetrant plus that nitrogen. You can also substitute medallion in there. And then these are the fungicides that are listed by this chemical control of turfgrass diseases. These are the fungicides that are ranked 3 and 4, which are the highest. Okay, so all the QOIs, a handful of the DMIs, affirm or endorse polyoxin D. One of the SDHIs is listed in there, and that's penthylpyrad or ballista. And then the phosphonates, but only when they're used in combination with chlorothalonil. They tend to be better once you get to the combo product. If you get into a curative situation, you really have to go with a contact and a penetrant and then follow it up 1 week later and then another week after that to kind of get it under control. And always remember that there are resistant biotypes. I have azoxystrobin on here, but it would be all the QOIs. And T-methyl, although I don't have it listed because it's ranked about a 2 in terms of control, it still provides pretty decent control and has been shown to have documented resistance. So that's my wrap up of anthracnose and what I think you need to do to get decent control. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have. All right. Sorry for the feedback errors issues on there. I don't know why it was different. I recorded it the same way I recorded the one for Monday, but it was a little bit of feedback in there. I would say let's hold questions because we're a little behind schedule until the end. So I'll get right on introducing our next speaker. Okay, Tanner Delval is a commercial horticulture educator with Penn State Cooperative Extension for both Schuylkill and Berks counties. His major focus areas include green industry, turf maintenance, weed control, vegetables, fruit, berries, and Christmas tree production. He received his Master of Science degree in agronomy from Penn State, his BS in turfgrass science from Penn State, and his AAS in logistics from the Community College of the Air Force. Tanner's professional experience includes golf course maintenance, a sales consultant for the green industry supplier, director of a lawn care company, and 6 years in the U.S. National Guard. So with that, I'm going to get his presentation up and hopefully.
Today we're going to talk about new options in turf management and using drones in turf. So when we look back at 2020, one of the first things folks like to talk about, what was the weather like? So depending on where you at or where you were in the state, it could have been dry, it could have been wet, depending on what time of the year it was. Basically, it was both wet and dry. So this image is a representation of what the precipitation was like in 60 days prior to July 14th. So for 2 months leading up to July 14th, or the middle of the summer, you can see that different parts of the state were different in the amount of precipitation that fell. So where I'm located in east central Pennsylvania in Schuylkill County, you can see Schuylkill and Berks County show that there was a pretty good amount of precipitation, at least over those 60 days when combined, versus portions of really the rest of the state, especially western Pennsylvania and just to the west and north and south of the State College area. But when you look at the year as a whole, from January through Thanksgiving, you can see that realistically it was, if you want to call it a fairly average year as far as precipitation goes. No county exceeded the 11 to 25% below rainfall amounts for that time period, which, it's not necessarily surprising. But some of the rain occurrences that we did have were few and far between for those out in western Pennsylvania, and some of them were, the ones in the eastern part of the state, were a lot at one time. Either way you look at it, this is really why we have jobs. We have to deal with these situations. There is no such thing as a normal year. There's a lot of different idiosyncrasies that go along with maintaining turf, no matter where you are. There will be easy times and tough times pretty much every year, and that will definitely influence some of the problems that we see and deal with in turf. Most of the time when I get called, it's usually to deal with problem areas and problem turf issues, whether it be insects, weeds, diseases. I don't typically get called for people to say, look how good my turf looks. It's usually to deal with problems and how to fix them. So I'll go through a couple pictures of some things that were some of the common things we dealt with this past season. This is one that has been repeat issues in wet years, especially in eastern Pennsylvania, but definitely can and does happen throughout the entire state. So this is obviously a stadium picture here. A lot of turf loss. Time of year would be late August into early September. I saw this on multiple fields, home lawns, a lot of different locations, even on golf courses. So when you get down close, you can see, really a loss of turf. Density is reduced. Kind of can look initially like grub damage, but grub preventers were used in this location and others that exhibited these issues. And when you get down even closer, you can see there's some lesions on the turf. Now this can look like a few different things. If you look here, you might be able to see some dollar spot lesions, but most of what we see here is actually gray leaf spot. There was some pythium in some years and on some locations where I do see this damage, in conjunction with gray leaf spot, but most of this damage was actually gray leaf spot on perennial ryegrass, but also tall fescue. So this turf that you see in this image here is actually tall fescue, and as the years go by, it seems like we're getting more and more tall fescue being infested with gray leaf spot, especially in locations that have a fair amount of ryegrass, perennial ryegrass with it. But so the recommendation for this site, and most of the time, is really, at that point, fungicides can be used to kind of stop the spread, but it's not going to bring back dead turf. So you're going to have to do a pretty aggressive aeration and overseeding to really bring it back. But it does work. This was an image taken of that same field that I just showed about 5 or 6 weeks after that first image was taken. So this is probably the first, second, third week of October or so. No special chemicals used here, or no fungicides. I mean, there was initial fungicide application to stop the spread, but really this is just 2 different overseedings, a little bit of light aeration, some dimple seeding, 2 applications of a starter fertilizer, um, and you can really get some good results. I mean, there were games being played on this throughout the duration of this issue, so you can definitely see that the field really went from a hero to, or from a 0 to a hero pretty quickly. So again, don't lose sight of the fact that seeding and fertilization can really pay dividends for you, especially in the fall. Seed being very expensive, and the seed costs seem to be increasing, over the last decade, but don't let that be the biggest barrier to doing some of these remedial issues or remedial tasks on your fields. At least don't look at it as a daunting task that the whole field needs to be overseeded or treated with, whether it be herbicide or fertilizer. I mean throughout a year on a stadium field, you should be doing fertilizer applications, but as far as a starter fertilizer application and seeding, really focus, if money is an issue, focus on or labor, focus on the areas that are really trafficked a lot, especially the crown of the field, the middle of the field. This is a football field here. Dave Minner at Iowa State used to talk about how to manage the field within the field. Most of the play of a football game is done between those hash marks. Not all of it, but most of it. Same thing with a baseball field. It's actually on the skinned area. Soccer field, focus on those areas inside the 18s, midfield. Those are the area, goal mouth. Those are the areas that you really need to focus on. So your seed costs are going to be considerably less when you focus on those areas. And it'd be a lot better to put all of your seed costs into that area than much at all in those outside areas. Now, that if you do have some funds that you can do the entire field, it's definitely going to pay dividends for you. So on your game fields, ones that, especially you have crowds watching, or maybe you have some television audience or something like that at certain points, or stadiums, those are the fields you want to focus on. Realistically, you should be overseeding several times in a season, not just one time at the front end, but definitely a few times. Now, maybe not putting seed down in November or December. The growing season might be a little bit too late at that point, but definitely focus on front end loading a lot of your seed, but several times throughout the season would be more beneficial than all at once. So as far as a rate, I mean, it really just depends on where, how much you're getting, how much you can afford. I mean, some recommendations you may find are, overseeding rates of 5 to 10 pounds, but that's really on like a turf that doesn't receive a whole lot of play. So if you're talking about a football field, 5 to 10 pounds is really a drop in the bucket. Realistically, you should be looking at, 15 to 20 to 25 pounds per thousand, at least between those hash marks or goal areas, because you really want to get a lot of new seedlings coming up there, especially under intense play. And do this every week if you can, or every other week, or time it at a point where you can consistently get some new seedlings coming up when there's going to be play. Also, providing a starter fertilizer is so important. Depending on what your soil test may suggest, you do want to make sure you provide some available phosphorus to seedlings, so that you're really giving them the best environment and the best nutrients available for the plant, so they can, compete and sustain some wear. As far as seed types, I mean, there's a lot of great varieties out there. You know, if the seed that you're looking to buy is really cheap, you're probably going to get cheap results. But as far as perennial ryegrasses are concerned, I mean, you can look at NTEP trial data, and same with tall fescue or Kentucky bluegrass, and you can look and see which varieties perform well depending on your seed supplier or your distributor. And a lot of the ones that these folks carry are pretty good. But buy as much as you can afford, and buy good varieties. There's a reason why we, in the United States and across the world, there's breeding programs to develop better cultivars. So using these and replacing the old varieties that are in your turf or on your fields is going to be a benefit, because there's a whole host of different things that breeders select for, and what you'd like to have out in your turf, whether it be, freeze tolerance, cold tolerance, heat tolerance, summer patch tolerance. There's a whole host of different reasons that you should really check with what you're putting down. Again, this is just to reiterate that applying a starter fertilizer is, super important. Anytime you use for seed, do any kind of seeding, you should be adding a starter fertilizer down. This is an old picture, but you can see the difference is huge. So when it comes to doing different renovations or cultural practices on turfgrass surfaces, aeration is a fundamental part of it, whether it be a home lawn, a golf course, an athletic field. There are situations when you should do some aggressive aeration. This is a newer type of a walk behind that actually is a reciprocating aerator that can, do a really good job without having to make multiple passes. You can, kind of slow your speed down and get some really good results. There's a lot of different types of aerators out there. I just wanted to kind of bring attention to the fact that pulling quality cores and then following it up with some overseeding is really important to do, especially on areas that really are struggling. So another thing to consider is how effective your aeration actually is. Now, I'm not going to go through every line on this chart, but this just shows how your tine size and your spacing can impact how much of the turf you're actually affecting. So obviously, the larger the tine size and the closer the spacing, the more area that you're going to impact. So the whole idea here is just that, think about going over these problem areas multiple times. Just aerating a field one time, one direction, especially if it's in really bad shape and you're really trying to make a change on that field, is not going to be enough. But if it's a maintenance type of an aeration, one or two passes may be fine. The more holes that you can poke on a field or on a lawn, if you're trying to do a conversion in species or trying to get, some areas established, the more you can, affect that turf. It's just going to yield you much, much better results. Another type of renovation or cultural practice you can do on these fields or some problem areas is with using an overseeder or a mat-away, something like this here. This is a walk-behind type. There are other types that you can, operate behind a tractor, but a slit seeder or something that you can pull up some thatch and potentially either at the same time or later come back and seed. Especially on fields or areas that have a lot of Kentucky bluegrass or creeping bentgrass, for instance, on a golf course. More vertical mowing or thatch removal is going to be necessary than, a field that's just perennial ryegrass or tall fescue, though those fields can benefit from dethatching or vertical mowing depending on their condition. But you can see here, on a home lawn that hasn't had this done can really pull up a lot of material. This wasn't set too deep. I actually performed this myself and rented the machine, and you can see that it really does pull up a lot of, material. It also is going to encourage a lot of good growth. That was just about 2,000 square feet of material there, one pass with a mat-away, and it pulls up a lot. Just to show you what it would look like afterward. This was done on September 5th of this past year, and you can see that it really does a number and reduces a lot of that turf canopy. But this was done in conjunction with aeration, and you can see, and you will see, that it definitely can make the lawn look a lot better. It wasn't that bad to begin with, but wanted to get some new cultivars in here, and over about a month and a half period of, providing some water and some fertilization, we got some good germination occurring, and that was about the third week of October there. So you can see those pictures were all taken at the same actual piece of grass, that same area. And you can see it really does make a huge difference. I actually put in turf type tall fescue into this lawn. Definitely makes a big difference. So think about that on some of your fields or some of your properties that are really giving you problems. A little bit of extra effort can make a big difference. Other ways that you can improve fields, some of these are kind of common sense. Non-game play is something that can really, I won't say ruin, though it can ruin a field, but it really can reduce the tolerance of a turf to withstand some traffic, especially traffic from a football game or from a soccer game. A lot of times we see this on fields that allow the band to be on there to practice, multiple times a week. That's just a discussion that you kind of have to have with the band director, or whoever is doing this non-game play that's on there. I mean, if you're having turf loss issues or wear issues, you really want to think about stopping non-game play, and that could be including practices too. Not always easy to accomplish, but I've seen it done in situations where you would otherwise think it would be tough to do. Increasing your mowing height obviously is going to be something that will help improve some traffic tolerance. There's a direct relationship, remember, between root depth and mowing height. So the higher you mow, the deeper the roots, though you got to keep that within reason of whatever the standards are for the sport. Using pre-germinated seed is an option if it's getting really used a lot and you want to give the seed a head start to come up. You can use a garbage can, put the seed in the bag. As long as the bag is porous, dunk the seed into it, let it dry, dunk it, let it dry, and then you can actually put it out there, and your germination time can be reduced to as little as a day or two if you do it properly with something like perennial ryegrass or tall fescue. The other thing is obviously moving goals around, especially practice goals. Just anything you can do to stop play in the same areas over and over. And when we talk about how to diagnose these areas, sometimes it's common sense, but a lot of times you don't notice a problem until it's too late. And when we talk about using drones, if that's an ability for you to implement, you can really pick up on these areas way sooner than later. So we'll talk about that. But the final thing here is just do not play in mud. I mean, it's just kind of common sense, but that's the fastest way to ruin a field. And you can do some serious harm to the structural integrity of a field by playing in super mud conditions. It's just better to postpone or cancel or reschedule a game, even if it's a day or two later than in mud, because you can lose a lot of turf that way. Other thing is using seed blankets. They're not that expensive. I mean, you can use them for years and years if you take care of them properly. A lot of different manufacturers. This is like a woven plastic material. And you can use them in areas that you're reseeding. You can put them on and take them off, very quickly. I mean, this is the size of a goal mouth here, and right where a goalie would stand. And you can see that by using this, it really makes a huge difference. I mean, this was pretty much bare about 3 weeks or 4 weeks before this was put down. So just something that you can consider. Covers are used a lot on areas that, over the winter time where you want to get grass to come in, which definitely can help and give you a head start in the springtime, but you can also use them for getting better seed germination. I mean, you can literally see, I pulled the tarp back here just a little bit, and you can see the difference in where the line of where that tarp was actually at, that growth blanket was at. I mean, just such a huge difference in germination success. So we'll talk briefly about some newer herbicides. There's not a whole lot of new ones every year, but there's some newer ones that folks may or may not have heard of. Here's a granular material called Crew. This material goes down between 3.5 and 4.5 pounds per 1,000 square feet. It has 2 active ingredients in it that are familiar in the turf market and turf world and ornamental world as dithiopyr and isoxaben, which would be dimension and gallery. And this material is labeled for both turf and for beds, so you can get some pre-emergent grass and some broadleaf material control in both areas. There's obviously a cost to it, but there may be situations where this is beneficial. maybe a use for some folks. So nut sedge is always an issue, pretty much on all turfs. There's several products out there, Dismiss or Solitaire, Sedgehammer, Pro Sedge. There's a few others. The newest product that's come out for control of nut sedge is Solero. Does work really well on Kalinga as well. It does work really well on nut sedge as well too. It's not labeled for putting greens, so you have to just be careful of some of the shortcut bentgrass turf of where you're using it. But Solero does work. The next slide we'll talk a little bit more about Solero. But there is a pre-emergent that's been out for a while called Echelon. It's a combination of prodiamine or barricade and sulfentrazone, which is in Dismiss. It works okay. You're not going to get 100% control with it, but there might be situations where you have really bad nut sedge issues year after year. You may want to look into using something like Echelon. But Solero, the active ingredient is amazosulfuron. It is a sprayable material. It is labeled for pretty much all the different types of turf that we have here in Pennsylvania and the Mid-Atlantic region. It is a systemic material, so it's the only selective nut sedge systemic material out there. It works kind of similar to Sedgehammer in the fact that it takes some time. It's not as fast as Dismiss, but it does seem to get some longer duration control down. So when you start seeing the nut sedge, get above the turf height, you can spray it on there, and depending on your rate, I've seen some pretty good control even at like 3/4 to half rates instead of a full label rate, and still getting pretty good control post-emergently. It's not pre-emergently, but pretty good control for the season with this material. Another one is SurePower. It's been out for a couple years now. It is a new form material, combination material of 2,4-D, triclopyr, fluoxapyr, and flumioxazin. Has a whole lot of different types of broadleaf weeds and some grasses on the label. It does give you pretty quick results, but it is an ester product, so you need to be careful with it. That flumioxazin that is in the material, in the SurePower, is actually SureGuard. And that is used, that flumioxazin or SureGuard is actually used as a pre and early post-emergent material in ornamentals and bare ground applications. So that's been out for several years. So they actually added this material to the SurePower to give some better control. And that flumioxazin is a contact material, so you'll see what the damage looks like in a few of these pictures. So I actually tried this material out. This was an area that had a lot of different types of weeds, ground ivy especially, and violets were in here. You can see that there is some rough bluegrass, water lays in this area. It's not really the most ideal location for trying a trial like this, but there's a lot of different things in there. And I wanted to see kind of how it would work. And what I noticed was you can see in this image that the violets were, dying, which was good. That was what we wanted. But we also had the speckling on the turf. You can see on that turf blade on my hand there that there's a bunch of little dead areas, little specks on there. And that's actually the tall fescue that's in there that was actually showing symptoms. So I was kind of alarmed. I thought that the turf might die from that. But because that flumioxazin that's in there, that's the one that's causing this damage, is a contact material, it only will affect where that droplet touched. So all of this type of damage would be mowed off. Nufarm did release a technical alert regarding the turf industry that I just described, and pretty much they discuss when the right time to spray is, and Nufarm recommends that you actually spray when it's warmer out. So that would be, when nut sedge is starting to pop up in the lawns, that this is when you'd spray it. So it is an option out there. There are situations where I would recommend it, but just be careful where you're using it and understand, sort of like tenacity, the damage that you may get or see for a little bit, though it's not long lasting. Another new one out from Dow is called Game On. It's got 3 different active ingredients in that: haloxyphene methyl, 2,4-D-choline, and fluoxapyr. Currently, it's only labeled for golf and cemeteries and some industrial sites, so it's not for home lawns or for athletic fields, at least not yet. But does control a bunch of broadleaf weeds. Just another option. Low use rates on that material as well. Another new material or newer material is Dismiss NXT, which is a combination of Dismiss and Quicksilver. So it's got sulfentrazone and carfentrazone in it. It is labeled for nutsedge and kalinga and a bunch of other different types of broadleaf weeds, but it also does have a label for Star of Bethlehem, which is this weed here. It looks kind of like a grass at first, but you know, once it starts to grow a little bit more, you get these flowers on it, which are obviously not a grass, and that Dismiss NXT is labeled for this. So here's a book that comes out every single year. It's actually from Purdue, but Penn State is listed on this publication as sort of like a collaborator on this. I think the current one out is from 2020. They are $20 a piece, or you can get a PDF version for $12. Again, it's from Purdue Extension. Cannot recommend this book enough because it really has it's kind of like the Bible for weed control. It's got a lot of great pictures in it for helping to identify, but also discusses what materials, what herbicides to use at what rates and when. It really is just a great publication that's very inexpensive. So the last little bit here, I'll talk about using drones in a sports field management program. You know, most of these pictures I took myself. You can see here, there's a lot of different uses that you can gain by using a drone on turf. That whole aerial perspective can just show you so much about a turf that you may not be able to see from the ground. So this image here is taken actually across from our extension office in Schuylkill County at a sports field complex, mostly soccer fields. You can see the fairy ring here. This is early in the season. This is like March or very early April, and you can see that you know, see some wear areas here, see areas that are, you know, really going to need some fertilization and some attention. So in order to get into using them, you need to understand the different aspects of the legality behind it, licensing, the different types of drones, and then the software and cameras and mapping that you can do with these drones. So there's several different levels, you know, of drones. You know, there's cheap ones all the way up to super expensive ones that are in the thousands of dollar range. So this is a Mavic Pro. The two that I'm going to discuss are the two most commonly used ones that are, I won't say the cheapest, but they are the most commonly and widely available that folks are going to use. So you have a Mavic or Mavic Pro. There's always changes being made to these and upgrades. So some of the terminology may have changed over the last year or two as far as models, but the Mavic and the Phantom series or Phantom 4 Pro, they're the two that I have used a lot and very extensively in most of my work, and they work great. But most of the use that I have used it for is actually for commercial use, and if you are going to be using this as a turf manager, it's pretty much guaranteed it's going to be for commercial use as well. So you will need to get a license to be a remote pilot, and that would basically allow you to do a bunch of different things with it, but commercial use is defined as you selling the photos or videos, doing a contracted service for someone else, using it for security or telecommunications, monitoring the progress of work. But the main one here is what we do in turf is using the imagery as a management decision tool. So basically, if you take a picture of something with a drone and then you do something because of it, it's considered a commercial use. So there are a bunch of rules. I'm not going to read all these to you, but you have to register your aircraft. You have to fly at a certain height, you know, no higher than 400 feet. There are exceptions to these rules that you can gain as part of a waiver process, but there's a speed restriction under 100 miles an hour. But you need to follow all these as part of flying. You need to take a remote pilot test. Typically, it's going to be at a knowledge testing center or an airport. You have to pass a background check, and then every 2 years you need to retest test. There's a bunch of different topics that you can or you will need to understand in order to pass the test. I took an online course at my leisure, and it worked great to allow me to pass. A lot of different types of airspaces out there. You can see here, you know, depending on the height and location of where airports may be, there are different types of airspaces around. Most of what we fly in is considered Class G airspace. You need to understand how to read these sectional charts. When I first saw this, I thought this was seriously daunting, which it is, but once it gets broken down for you, you can really understand how they work. The nice thing is there's actually apps out there now. One is the Know Before You Fly app that really kind of tailors the maps to using it for drones or unmanned aircraft. Obviously, you know, we need to be careful about where we're flying because it's definitely a security issue, and this is only going to increase as time goes by. As far as using it in turf, though, you can gain a perspective. You know, here's a Little League field in my hometown that you can see where some of the turf is really struggling. It's not from where, because, you know, this is in the outfield. We see a lot of this field starting to kind of thin out because baseball is not played in the outfield, you know, for the most part, just from the 3 outfielders, but you can see we're losing some turf out there. You can also see where people paint really bad lines. You can see that center circle there is a little bit crooked. A lot of different vantage points that you can gain from being high up above, especially on a field where you want to really look good. I use these in commercial production of Christmas trees. It helps folks be able to count and monitor progress of where some crops are growing. Just a lot of different uses that we see. But as on a sports field complex, you know, you can, you know, help to market your company or your golf course to use in, you know, marketing pieces or on a website. But most of the time it's for monitoring, you know, goal mouse wear areas, using it for fertility, irrigation coverage, and for pest management. You know, just some pictures of some irrigation audits. You can see fertility issues. You know, here's where a sprayer actually was having some issues here. See the goal mouse areas that need some serious overseeding. You can use NDVI as an option on some of these cameras, or the purchase of an additional camera to mount on them to be able to identify, you know, hot and cool areas in the turf. You can actually, even in this image, see mowing lines. So you can see where areas are starting to stress out before you actually see them, and then kind of ground truth them with your own eye. So here's another example here of a football field before the season starts. And then in mid-October, you can see it looks like one end of the field there is actually getting more wear than the other end of the field, even though it's mostly between the hash marks. And then you can actually see some recovery in those areas in mid-December. You can also use a drone to measure, depending on software, you can actually use the drone to measure how much soil is in a pile. So you can fly at a certain height and speed, and there's programs that can do this for you with the drone that you have, but you can actually fly around this pile and it'll actually tell you how much soil is in a pile, or sand if that's something that you need to know. So they use these in construction projects a lot. Again, just so many different uses that are out there. I mean, really the possibilities are endless with this. So that's all I have. Happy to answer any questions if you have any. Thank you for your time.
Okay, nice presentation, Tanner. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanner.
We have time for questions, Brad, if you want to administer those.
Okay. Let's see, we do have a question up there. Could you touch on spring aeration timing as it relates to effective crabgrass control in a sports field home lawn setting? We don't want to open too soon with little active growth, but also don't want to open and leave an unhealed void for crabgrass to grow into. Any thoughts on that one, Tanner?
So, can you repeat the very first part? There was 2 parts of that.
Okay. Could you touch on spring aeration timing as it relates to effective crabgrass control in a sports field or home lawn setting?
Yeah, so if you're gonna do any spring aeration, I mean, though we don't typically recommend it, if you have to get out there and do it, you can use a starter fertilizer with tenacity in it. That'll give you some crabgrass suppression. It's not going to give you the season-long suppression, but we've seen pretty effective results. Spring aeration, or even thin areas that you do need to do some overseeding, you can put down seed at the same time as tenacity. And there are granular materials. I know Lebanon makes a product that's a granular material, starter fertilizer and tenacity or mesotrione in the material you can put down in the springtime. If you're going to do any of this work, though, it should be done out the gate as soon as you can in the springtime before all the weeds really start popping. You'll need to follow that application up with a probably a dimension application in May or very early June, but likely hopefully in May. I hope does that address the question?
I think so. Let's see. Right, because it was just a matter of time and when to do that, or just when to trying to avoid opening it too soon, or not giving it a chance to heal up once you punch holes. So
yeah, a starter fertilizer with seeding, and that
Okay.
starter fertilizer should be the one I would suggest using, the one that has tenacity in the bag.
Okay. Great. Let's see. Oh, and I will, I need to post numbers for the GCS AA, so I will get those posted in here. All right. And I'll put these in the chat. Make sure that goes to everybody. There we go. And so then I do have here, so then these programs then for the week then have been approved for 0.2 GCS AA points per day. And so I went ahead and kind of listed some of the numbers that we have there. So then for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and up to today then, and then I'll also have a number then for tomorrow as well. And so those numbers for the GCS AA credits are posted there. There was a question about these meetings have been recorded to get credit. However, though, with credit, you'll be working on just the ones that you actually see. I think that was my understanding on that one, right, John?
Correct.
Correct.
I think that was the restriction based on how we had this set up with all the states, is that the pesticide credits had to be viewed live with your name entered into the chat box.
So, and let's see, we got something else. Oh yes, and then are we doing the same thing today for pesticide credits? Yes, and so then again, just as a reminder, yes, for pesticide credits, please in the chat box, please input your name, your state of residence, and your certification number.
Yeah, and Brett, the reason you probably didn't see that is because people are generally sending them in just to the panelists and not to all the attendees.
Gotcha.
So that's probably why you're not. I will make an announcement for tomorrow too, in terms of what the agenda is. Brad's going to be talking about weather apps and making weather-based decisions. Jenny's going to be back talking about pesticide exposure, and Dr. Lanscoot will be here to talk about post emergence control of annual and perennial grasses in turf. So that's the agenda for tomorrow, and that'll wrap up day 5. There was a question too about whether these are going to be posted anywhere after the fact, and yes, I will get them up on our YouTube channel, Penn State Turfgrass YouTube channel at some point next week probably. Again, they'll be there and you can revisit and watch them, but the pesticide credits will not be available for those.
And hopefully then you should be able to see the GCS AA numbers. I forgot to hit enter. It kind of helps if you hit enter once you put them in there. So there you have it. So you should have 4 sets of numbers for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So I appreciate your patience on that one as well.
Okay, if there's no more questions, then I'm going to end the recording. Thank you everybody for coming. We really appreciate it. And if you have any other questions, then just email us or let us know, and hopefully we'll see you back tomorrow.
Great.